Welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Xuan Yo, and I'm one of the 2F Fellows this year. Our culture is deeply devoted to the idea that there are only two sexes. The very language we use seems to refuse other possibilities. This is illustrated as well by the way the medical profession treats infants born with ambiguous genitalia. When these infants are born, physicians often suggest drastic measures and surgeries to assign a specific gender to the child. The regimen usually involves the doctors deciding what sex the child ought to be. Then, the infants are surgically reconstructed to conform to the diagnosis. Body parts are taken out, others are added, hormones are given or taken away. In the end, the doctors have taken a body that was clearly neither male nor female and have turned it into one that they can present to the world as strictly male or female. This difficult issue is one our speaker tonight seeks to address. Fausto-Sterling is a Nancy Duke Lewis Professor Emerita of Biology and Gender Studies in the Department of Molecular Biology, Cell Biology, and Biochemistry at Brown University. She's also the former director of the Science and Technology Studies program at Brown. She participates actively in the field of sexology and has written extensively about the biology of gender, sexual identity, and gender roles. She's the author of several acclaimed books, including Sex, Gender, Biology in the Social World, and Sexing the Body, books that are referenced widely in feminist and scientific inquiry, as well as scientific publications in developmental genetics and developmental biology. Dr. Fausto-Sterling's current research is focused on applying dynamic systems theory to the study of gender differentiation in early childhood. This evening's presentation is co-sponsored by the Center for Writing and Public Discourse and by the Berger Institute for Work, Family, and Children. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fausto-Sterling to the Athenaeum.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm hoping that can be taken out of my eyes a little bit. Thanks. Yeah, that's better. Thanks. So it is a real pleasure to be here. I thank you all for coming out to hear what I have to say. What I want to do tonight is try to offer you a different kind of language to think about gender and sexuality, but I'll be talking primarily about gender tonight and by implication about sexuality. So in a way, the take-home message is in my title. I want us to think of gender as a process, not a fixed trait. And I want to show you what this might mean by talking to you about a research project that I've been engaged in for the last 10 or so years that's not a final answer by any means, but rather shows you how you could do research on gender as it develops, rather than thinking of it as something that just appears in a fixed manner. So when we think about, when we talk about gender in early development, most psychologists will say that, that by 3 years of age, there are three more or less strong differences in gender that between boys and girls. One is in language, and the usual assertion is that girls acquire language sooner than boys, and they have a bigger vocabulary, they get better at expressing themselves, and that's a difference that is reasonably robust. Not everyone agrees with that. Not everyone agrees with any one of these things. But these are usually the standard things. You're likely to find them in a textbook. Someone was telling me they saw some of this on WebMD. I think you can find this stuff if you look at child development websites, sort of popular websites. The next is motor activity. And the usual assertion is that boys are more physically active than girls by age 3, and maybe even from birth. And that this might, in turn, explain all sorts of things in the future about boys maybe liking more active game playing than girls and that kind of thing. And then the third is toy preference. And here again, people say that by age 3, you see a very clear distinction in what kind of toys boys like and what kind of toys girls like. So these differences do appear to some degree or another fairly early in development by age 3. And the question is, where do they come from? And there are a couple of, I'll talk to us about 3 different models. The first theory is that you have nature and nurture, and that they get added together. And this is from a book, cartoon is from a book called The Mirage of a Space Between Nature and Nurture by Evelyn Fox Keller. And what it says down here is, here is a bucket. Billy fills it with 40 liters of water, then Susie fills it with 60 liters of water. So 40% of the water in the bucket is due to Billy and 60% to Susie. And that's a common way that nature and nurture are framed in a popular discussion, in which you say, well, it's partially genetic and it's partially social. But my view is that it's not, and most geneticists would not agree with this kind of framing today. They'd offer you something a little bit more complicated. They'd say genes interact with the environment. And in this case, the cartoon says, but suppose instead what happened was this. Susie brought a hose to the bucket, and then Billy turned the tap on. Now how much of the water is due to Billy and how much to Susie? Because evidently you need both the hose and the turning on of the tap. The answer to that question is that the question itself, that partitioning, no longer makes sense. And this, I think, is what most geneticists say. They say there's this interaction between genes and environment, and then they just study the genes. And so, which always leaves me a little frustrated. But I think that this formula also is incomplete. And so the question is, what's missing from this model? And my answer is what I will talk about for the rest of the session tonight, which is something that I call iterative development. And what I mean by this is that as an individual develops, they go through numerous iterations in which whatever happens at time 2 has to build on whatever happened at time 1. And whatever happens at time 3 is working with the body that exists and the mind and the proclivities that exist at time 2. So what you have are timed iterations of development in which you always build on what goes before. And that's true for both what the social and sensory input to the body is or was, and also how the body itself has developed. So instead of using these kinds of interactive approaches, I've been developing something called dynamic systems theory. I by no means have developed this, but what I have done that's new is apply it to the study of gender. And I'm going to start out fairly abstractly, and then I'll try to bring it down to gender and development. So what you do with dynamic systems theory is that one way of conceptualizing it is that you have this landscape, which here is just, it's corrugated, and you have valleys, and you have peaks, and you have a time dimension, and the time dimension is essential to this point of view. So you start, if we think of starting up here as starting at birth, and which is also an arbitrary place to start because obviously important things happen prenatally too. But, and down here is some time after birth, and there are different times in between. You see that if each of these little balls represents a baby, that they start out fairly, not identical, but fairly close together, and as they move down, as they travel down, they end up moving into a fairly deep valley, which are called in the theoretical terms for this is an attractor valley. So that's one attractor. Another ball might roll into a different attractor that has a somewhat different shape to it. The peaks on the sides of the valley are fairly steep. So that offers stability to the location, but they're not insurmountable, so they aren't necessarily permanently stable. And then you have unstable places, which are indicated here as repellers at the sort of tops of the top of the valleys, or at the peaks. And these are not very stable places energetically, and sooner or later, an infant that's perched, or a developing individual who's perched up on the top is going to roll one way or another. So if we try to make this a little bit more specific, still pretty abstract, But we have, let's think of us as having two infants. And here there's neonate A and neonate B, and they're with time neonate plus time 1, neonate plus time 2. And there are several different valleys here. This one happens to have rolled down into this valley, but they might have rolled down into this valley with the right push. In this one, the shape of the landscape is different. There are also several valleys, but they're in different shapes and places, and they may roll in different directions. And if we think of these attractor basins, now if we say maybe we can think of these attractor basins as variable gender expression or gender or identity formation, then we can imagine that we begin to develop children who have some variety of both forming identity and forming gender expression. And that happens with time. Now, what might be shaping the underlying landscape? My argument to begin with is that especially during the first year of life, the kinds and amounts and varieties of sensory input are essential to shaping the landscape in which the child is developing. And so the important things that we look at are touch, affection, speech, motor stimulation. There are other sensory inputs. And that these can reshape the developmental landscape, and do reshape the developmental landscape that the child is developing in, especially during the first year of life. And that this has been the importance of sensory input and parent-infant interaction during the first year of life as part of a shaping of later gender formation in this period, which is pre-symbolic, pre-linguistic, has been very neglected. All right, so I'm going to now show you one more example, and this is this you will see in a minute will be a video that that an animation that a Brown student did for me, and we're starting here. We'll be starting here at birth, and we have 5 different babies, and they're each a little different. One of them's kind of sleepy, and one of them's wiggly, and the point in this animation will be several-fold. You'll start to see this landscape here, and this will recede because this is the landscape. It's a pretty flat landscape at birth. You'll start to see attractors develop in it, and you'll see that he starts to give them different shadings or colors. So one's sort of pinkish, and one's kind of bluish, and there's different purplishes in between. And you'll also see that these kids are not totally passive. So the kids bring something to it. One of them, this one crawls over here, this one crawls somewhere else. So the kids are also moving themselves along the landscape as the landscape itself is developing. And let's see if I can get it started now. Didn't I just start it before? I did. Isn't that odd? I had it going when we did the setup. All right, I'm going to have to do what I did last time, which is escape from here for a second. Come on. There we go. I'll run it for you this way. So you can see, there they go. They're moving down the landscape. You begin to see at 3 months, there's beginning to be a little bit of formation here. Here, a little bluish, little bit of valleys, and then they're moving down. Now they're getting steeper at 6 months. And one of the things you see now is that, oops, get out of here. Sorry. We'll just watch it through again. At 6 months, you're starting to see, or at 8 months, you're starting to see the kids are wearing different clothing. There's sort of a spectrum of gender expression. This is still going to be a lot of it sort of parentally derived. But by 12 months, 12 to 18 months, kids are starting to have their own views about what kind of clothing they want to wear. 6 months we have here. And then there they go some more. And now you have this variety. You have a very sort of a little girl in a dress, a little girl in pants, a boy in a baseball hat and jersey, a boy with a teddy bear, and then you have this kid who's gotten kind of stuck behind one of the hills and isn't sure where he's going to end up, or she, because we don't know actually what they are one way or another. But in this video, we don't know. So it just gives you a kind of dynamic where you started way back when on this back horizon in time with a pretty flat landscape, and the landscape slowly begins to develop, and it also begins to differentiate, and you get actually a spectrum of gender expression and a spectrum of identities finally. So let me go back here. And I'll go on to the next. So the hypothesis that I've started out this study with is that small cumulative events have large effects. And let me just put the laser pointer on this again. This is very bizarre. These were all working before. Let me just get this out of here. There we go. I don't know why this isn't working. No. All right. Best laid plans. Shush. No, I don't. Okay, so if this shows you what I'm talking about when I use these videos. So So there's several things you're seeing here. One is, there we go. So we're seeing in this video, we see motor play going on. We see speech and other vocalization happening. And we see affectionate touch. And we see a repetition. And these are so this is what I mean when we have small cumulative events. And if these go on, these are part of the intimate interplay between parents and children in the first year of life. So what we did in this study was to take a data set that was a found data set. These were tapes that were made for another purpose by a colleague of mine. And we had 15 boys and their mothers and 15 girls and their mothers. And we had biweekly in-home videos of so-called naturalistic play. We did 5-minute random sample second-by-second analysis. So for each of these 5-minute things, we did 300 seconds in which we were coding both what the mothers were doing and what the infants were doing. And we had them on the same time scale code so we could see what their interactions were. And we did this as a longitudinal sample, which is part of my argument, is that you have to study behaviors before they show up and watch them emerge. So we did this for months 4 through 13. We had 20 samplings per family, about 30 families, 600 observations. And for each observation, we have between 50 and 60 specific behaviors that we looked at. So you're not going to hear about all of those, I promise you. So what we coded was the following. We coded infant activities of various sorts. We coded maternal infant vocalization. we coded maternal play types and interactive behaviors, maternal vocalization. And what I want to share with you tonight are the sort of most traditional ways of analyzing data like these, which are pretty limiting, and then the ways in which we've added on sort of non-traditional but more dynamic approaches. Now, this is probably going to offer me the same trouble. Huh. Isn't that annoying? Come on. So in this is traditional results. I turned the laser off. It didn't help. Yeah, but I can get rid of this, which will make everything bigger. So yeah, it may be something about the VGA. I don't know, but I'll play with it after. So in this example, with standing activity, we'll let you listen to it. 4-month-old child. Okay, so that's an interaction with a 4-month-old baby, a girl, obviously, and her mother. And then if we look at this same-age child,
oh, kissing you. Enough kisses. That's enough kisses, Mom. That's enough. Oh, he's getting so excited. You stand? Let's work out those legs. Let's work out those legs. Come on. Up, up. Good boy. You're getting strong. Look at you. Look at you. You're a tough kid. See?
okay, you're a tough kid, it ends with. So we can analyze, I'm sure that everybody here noticed in these two samples rather different kinds of approaches to supporting the children as they were standing, in which, first of all, the mother of the little boy was holding the child further away from her body and supporting him, and he was doing more of his own leg support that way. She was also praising his muscular strength and telling him how tough he was. So we did what a standard thing, which is to ask whether mothers use different words with their girl babies and their boy babies. And the one thing that we found that was quite significant was that the mothers of boys encouraged their movement a great deal more verbally than do the mothers of girls. And that otherwise there aren't any significant differences, although there are differences. But with such a small sample number and doing the sort of standard statistics that are usually done, none of the other differences rose to the level of statistical significance. So there are other analytical approaches besides this, and I'm going to tell you about each of these in turn, so you can begin to see how you can get at more subtle behaviors by looking in this period, or by doing any time a detailed analysis over time. The first of these is landscape analysis, and I'll go over each of these. Second, 3D developmental analysis. The third, state space grids to measure attractors. The fourth, longitudinal analysis. And the last one, modeling difference using a computer modeling approach that actually comes out of economics, and that I did with a colleague at Grinnell College. So First, landscape analysis. In this kind of analysis, you're still using a kind of standard statistical approach in which you're comparing means and standard deviations, but you're able to display difference of several traits at once and do it graphically so that you begin to get some sense of what's going on at the same time. So here we have let me go back to the laser pointer. So here we have different maternal traits, maternal behaviors, assisting the infant to move around, caretaking, lifting them up, assisting fine motor, affectionate touch, stimulating gross motor. These are all maternal behaviors that are going on often together. And what we have here are the frequency of these behaviors, and they can all get normalized, so we're working on the same scale. The duration of these behaviors at age 3 to 4 months for girls and for boys, and then you can subtract the one from the other, so that in this case, the difference, the peaks that are above are behaviors that are happening more from the mothers of boys, and the ones that are below ground are the ones that are happening more for the mothers of girls. And so you can see, and I've put an asterisk behind the ones that are statistically significant. So you can see that mothers of girls are engaging in more caretaking behavior, and by caretaking I mean adjusting their clothing, combing their hair, fixing a ribbon, sort of things that make them, look neater or nicer. And they're engaging in more physical activity with the boys, moving them around more, rocking and jiggling them, lifting them up. These are the ones that are significant. Insignificant but different, and I'll show you that I believe this is a real difference, is affectionate touch. So mothers are being more affectionate to their sons than they are to their daughters. And the one that I expected to find something different from, I didn't here, but it shows up later on in a more dynamic analysis, which is stimulating gross motor development, of the sort of thing where a child is lying on his back and the parent is like playing bicycle with the legs, or moving their limbs around more. So just to give you an idea, these differences also show up very early, 3 to 4 months of age. They're almost all gone by 11 to 12 months, and I could show you the decline in between, but you don't need to see all of the graphs. So you see that the difference is just about flattened out here, and there's only one significant difference left at 11 to 12 months, which is the assist shift, which is the mothers are still moving the boys more, mothers of boys are moving them around more than are mothers of girls. So that's one approach. You can at least see several behaviors together, and you can get a sense of what the overall landscape vision of how all these behaviors work together, because obviously parents aren't doing these things one at a time, but they're doing several together. So suppose instead we move on to something that I've called three-dimensional developmental analysis, and basically I'm putting 3 behaviors on 3 different axes and presenting the results as a mesh. And here we have, so we have 3 maternal behaviors: assisted locomotion, affectionate touch, and maternal vocalization. And the blue dots are the mothers of sons, the red squares are the mothers of daughters, and the mesh is from the mothers of daughters, and it gives you a sense of the 3-dimensional space occupied by different behaviors. And to show you how this falls out a little bit, I've just put in this circle, which shows you how most of the mothers of sons, and I'll show you this another way, occupy a certain state space, 3-dimensional state space, that's different from the 3-dimensional state space that the mothers of daughters occupy. So with regard to these 3 traits at 3 to 4 months. And there's another way to look at this, which is more statistical. You can ask whether these behaviors form into any kinds of clusters. And then, just to move back here for a second, the clusters would represent, say, a group here, a group here, a group here. You can ask a statistical program to pull out these clusters for you. And we found 3 clusters. And in the example of the first cluster, here we had the highest amount of maternal vocalization, the lowest amount of assisted locomotion, and the lowest amount of affectionate touch. And in that cluster, you had 2 boys and 6 girls. So that's cluster 1. In cluster 2, you have the lowest amount of maternal vocalization, the next highest amount of assisted locomotion, and the next highest amount of affectionate touch, and 13 of the boys fall into that cluster, and 6 of the girls fall into the other cluster. And then you have 2 girls, the mothers of girls, I mean, who form what statisticians would call outliers. These are a different style of parenting altogether from the others. And in this style of parenting, you have a great deal of maternal vocalization, a huge amount of assisted locomotion, and the highest amount of affectionate touch. And so one of the problems with outliers in traditional statistics is that they mess up your average. So if you're looking to find a mean difference, an average difference that's statistically significant, and you have like 2 families that have a totally different behavior pattern, you can't get that statistical difference to show. And since we're working with small numbers, there's nothing that makes one of these patterns more legitimate than the other. It's not surprising that with parents of newborns, and these are first-time mothers, that there's going to be a huge variation in pattern. What is surprising is that any gender-related differences show up. So what you see is that there's a very strong gendered pattern, and then there's a couple of families that are just doing it their own way. And this will show up in the next approach to analyzing this, which, well, not in this one, but in the one after, state space grids. And in state space grids, and I'm going to have to go back to the other video mode to show you this, but I am first going to magnify this for you a little bit so that you can see it. You have on the one axis, you have the mothers in what we call a play frame. So we have a mixed play frame, a motor social play frame, an object play frame, and then just off play. And so you have the way in which the mother is interacting with the child on one axis, and here you have a whole bunch of specific maternal behaviors. This one, for example, being affectionate touch, this one being assisted locomotion. And so the state space grid will say, well, how often does an individual, and you can put this on a time scale so that you can run through the entire 300 seconds of any 5-minute period and see how the mothers move from one state space to another as they interact with their child. So here you have not a lot going on with regard to, this is the mother of a girl. And actually, let me get out of this for a second. There we go. So this is the mother of a girl. This is the mother of a boy of the same age. Here you see that there's almost no time spent. They just pass through the state space of motor social play and affectionate touch. Whereas here, for the mother of this boy, there's a lot of time spent, some time spent with affectionate touch and a lot of time with assisted locomotion. And you have these other things: object play, play frame, object manipulation. Now I'm going to show you another video that I've put together of this. And here what I want you to look at is not the absolute final differences, but the patterns between these 2 individual families, the differences in patterns in a 5-minute play period. And that's weird. I don't understand why this was working before, but at any rate, I mean, when we tried it out before, it must have something to do with how we expanded the monitor, but at any rate. Come on, let's get out of here. No. don't want those little things. So the green is the mother, these are 5-month-olds, is the mother of a girl, the blue is the mother of a boy. These are 10-second intervals, so you'll see, and I've just put them together. And the main thing I want to show you here is, I just stopped it for a second, is that the patterns are just different. They're not taking place in the same state spaces at all. And if we go through until the end, you'll see this. And of course, you can multiply this. You can, using the state space grids, you can export time spent in these different grids. You can do all sorts of statistics on them. But this is to give you the dynamic of what happens in a 5-minute play period. And now this is the cumulated 5 minutes shown superimposed on each other. And what you can see here is a lot of blue here again in this assisted locomotion motor social play. Here you see more green than blue in a state space that is object play with manipulation. And this is a difference that I won't emphasize more today, but it's something that I will end up trying to publish, is that the object play manipulation, the mother manipulates the object for the child and shows them how it works. Whereas in the one next to it, where there's more activity from the mother of the son, you have offering the object. So when object play offering, the mother is, instead of showing and demonstrating, is actually giving the object to her son and getting her son to play with it. So you have, and this is the main thing, these different patterns, and you can do all the right statistics on them. But the important point is that you can study these patterns dynamically, and you can study them over the entire longitudinal sample that you have, and you can see how they change back and forth. So going back here to the last approach, which is longitudinal analysis. The second to last approach. The beauty of the longitudinal analysis is that it addresses individual variability and also allows you to see outliers in small samples, so that what you get is a sense of the individual patterns in individual families, and you can really see it. So this is, I've gone back to looking at change over time for the duration of affectionate touch. And each of these different colored lines here is a different family, and we're looking at the duration of affectionate touch, and this is age here. So this is 20 weeks, 30 weeks, up to 60 weeks shown here. And you can see, and this is the mothers of girls here, and you can see both these two outliers, actually, who are highly affectionate. They start out way high up here. It's the same two families we saw in that other example. And then they go careening down, so that by 22 weeks or so, they've kind of flatlined out here. And then there may be some variations in between. This black line here is what's called an average regression line. So you can see how the average of these families looks. The pattern for the mothers of boys is similar in one sense, in that in the early days, in the young kids, there's much more affection, and that begins to decline with age. And that's true for both boys and girls. But you see both a wider variation of pattern for the boys, and the regression line is higher up. It's got a much higher y-intercept, I think the scale here is 25 seconds in any one 5-minute time period versus 10. And then you can add on top of this an average regression line, where you have the dotted lines here are 95% confidence levels for these lines, and the blue is the regression line for all of the mothers of boys together, and the green for all of the mothers of girls together, for the duration of affectionate touch, and with month. And what it says down here is that the y-intercepts do indeed differ with a pretty high significance, a probability of 0.007, which is usually considered a fairly robust thing if you do the statistics at all. So you can see here, if you just do a standard t-test or ANOVA kind of approach to statistics, you get no difference in affectionate touch levels, even though it looks like there is when you look at the. But if you do a longitudinal study and look at the patterns of behaviors over time, you begin to see a difference that that you can show is real statistically. So if we look at a few examples, the affectionate touch, in this case, this is the number of events. And here, too, there's a significant difference with the boys at 3 to 4 months, starting out, the mothers of boys at a higher level of affection offered. There's also here, the gross motor stimulation shows up as having a different pattern, although the means showed they looked absolutely flat in that initial images that I showed you. And here, the slope is different. So the boys start out high and move down quickly. The girls start out somewhat in the same range, but move at a different slope. So the pattern or shape of behavior over time is different on average for the mothers of girls and the mothers of boys. You see the caretaking. There's also a slope difference here, and I already showed you this before, but there are a lot more caretaking events for mothers of girls in these early months, and they slowly move down into the same range as the mothers of boys. There's just overall, the mothers of boys are not doing as much caretaking from the get-go, and they do a little bit, and then there's even less as time goes on. And then the last example I'm showing you here is the number of times a child is lifted up in the air. And here, too, the mothers of boys, the y-intercepts are quite different, with the mothers of boys doing a lot more of it than the mothers of girls, and over time it begins to move into the same area. So this longitudinal analysis allows you both to look at the individual family patterns and also shows up certain kinds of behavior patterns, mothering patterns with time that don't show up at any one individual time period, or even if you average all the time periods together, the different family patterns just sort of swamp them. But if you look at this developmentally, you can see different behavioral patterns emerging. So then let me move to the big missing question, which is, can we say behaviors that happen at time 1 affect other behaviors at time t+1? In other words, if something that happened early on, does that affect something that happens later? And this brings me to this last kind of modeling. VAR means vector autoregression modeling, and IRF means impulse response function. I'll explain to you in simple terms, because honestly, I only really know. I don't know the math. This involves solving or using a computer program to solve several simultaneous equations at a level of math that I'm not equipped to do, but that's what you collaborate with people for. I'll first show you the simple example in which you have this squiggly line here is teacher enthusiasm. This is an example of interdependency between teacher enthusiasm and student engagement. And so you have time I and time I+1. And so you have a certain level of teacher enthusiasm here at time I. And it may affect teacher enthusiasm at time I+1, so there may be that self effect. You may keep yourself going as a teacher. But it also may affect student enthusiasm at time I+1. So an enthusiastic teacher at time I may produce enthusiastic students at time I+1. And then you also have student engagement. So an engaged student body may also affect teacher enthusiasm, and there may be the self engagement. So if you come in, if there's a group of students in a class who are very engaged to begin with, they may keep each other going. So that's the general idea of the VAR modeling, and you can make this into You can add any number of factors into it. So here we have teacher enthusiasm, we have learning material, we have student engagement, and we have time I and time I plus 1. And teacher enthusiasm can affect all of these things. The learning material can affect all of these things. And student engagement can affect all of these things. And by the time you do this, you have a visual kind of spider web or cat's cradle for those of you who ever played that game when you were young. I don't know if you play it anymore. But anyway, but you can ask then, suppose you pull on one of these strings at time 1, what will it affect at time I plus 1? And you can do that using computer modeling. And we're still with this example. What happens when you pull on one string in the web? What happens at the next time? And the question mark, it's a question mark. Will it affect either of these things at time I plus 1 or I plus 2? So we applied this approach to some of our data. This is a work in progress. We still don't have full answers to this, but we looked at maternal touch, maternal assist locomotion, infant reaching, infant banging, and infant independent walking. And we looked at how all of these might affect one another, pulling on each of these strings at time 1. And we did find the following. For boys, for frequency and duration, if we pulled on the independent infant walking string at time I, it affected increased maternal touch at time I plus 1. And it also increased the mother assisting locomotion. All the black lines had no effect, so we tried all of those. There were no other effects that we showed in this particular set of studies. But if we did the same experiment for girls, we simply found that there were no effects. So increased walking, independent walking for girl babies at time I did not increase maternal touch or maternal assist locomotion at time I plus 1. So that was a difference in something that happened at one time moving on to another. I'm going to pass that one by. So our statistically significant results were you have maternal assist locomotion. There's one example I didn't show you. If that increase, one of the things it does affect infant reaching in boys, and it decreases infant reaching for boys' durations. Infant walking, if that increases, it increases maternal touch, and it increases maternal assisting locomotion. And that is both for boys' frequencies and durations, and really for the mothers of boys. Back here. And there were no effects for the mothers of girls. So any of these behaviors that changed, like infant walking, in girl infants did not result in changes in maternal assist locomotion or maternal touch. So, conclusions. These are the bigger conclusions. I'm not reaching a final conclusion about what's happening with gender. First of all, I haven't finished the analysis. But second of all, it isn't my main point right now. The main point is about how we can study the emergence of gender over time. So to explore the emergence of behavioral differences, we need longitudinal samples. That's the first thing. So you don't learn much by studying something only at one time. The next is that we need to look at developmental minutiae. That is, we need to look not at the big exhortative, real boys don't play with dolls kinds of things. That happens later, and I don't think it's the main thing that's going on. Because plenty of real boys go ahead and play with dolls even if mom or dad tells them not to. But the developmental minutiae are the sensory input, how we're touched, how we're handled, how parents and others respond in the moment to specific behaviors. And these are subtle responses. They're not the big sort of pejorative responses. We need to look multimodally and multidimensionally, and I've given you some examples of that. We need to see several behaviors at one time. That's what's meant multimodally. And we need to look multidimensionally. So we need to look at state spaces and how different states and spaces become places that attract a parent-infant dyad, and multidimensionally with the time dimension worked in. And the time dimension is just essential to trying to understand how gender develops. We need to look at developmental patterns, and that's the lesson from the longitudinal studies. So it's not just about a difference at any one time point, but how a pattern might look different over time. And we need statistical methods that offer dynamic insight. And these are methods like the VAR-IRF. It's one example. I think there are other ones out there that talented statisticians could and have developed. And I think that that's another thing that we need in order to look profitably at infant development. So in short, we need to study gender as a dynamic system. Here we go. Not the addition of separable factors. And we need to understand gender as a developmental process, which can be assessed at different points in the life cycle, but cannot be measured as a fixed or archetypal trait. And that maybe is my biggest take-home point. So I'll finish by acknowledging my collaborators, Damien Kelty-Stephen, who's a psychologist at Grinnell, his undergraduate student, Elizabeth Eason, 3 undergraduate students of mine, Gopika Krishna, Phil Park, and Malika Hale, a postdoc, Jihung Sung, my 2 psych colleagues, Cynthia Garcia-Call and Ron Cipher, and as I say, tens of Brown University undergraduates who did all of that coding, which is a huge amount of work. It took 4 years to get those videotapes coded into the data set that now we've spent quite a number of years analyzing. And if anyone wants to find what's been published already from this study, these are the publications, and I have them all available for download on a website called researchgate.net. And those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's easy to find, and you can find it and find my name and download any of these papers that you want to look at. So that's what I have to tell you, and I gather that there's a question and answer period also. Thank you. Can one of you get me my glass of water? Thanks.
So we have time for questions. So if you have one, please raise your hand, and Shwen or I will come to you with the mic.
Hello, thank you for an interesting talk. I was interested in sort of the lack of predictability for the girls, where you find these correlations for the boys. And I was wondering if, statistically, whether or not it just had to do with the lack of variability. And more generally, with regards to variability, from your data, it seems to suggest that mothers are more consistent in their interaction with girls, and there's more variability in how they react to the boys. So not necessarily between mothers, but within and across the different types of behaviors. So data seems to suggest that. And so I was wondering if you can comment on that, and to the extent that how this variability may be influencing sort of general socialization
so
patterns
when
later
you're
on.
talking about variability, are you meaning at different ages?
So I'm speaking actually across the different codes. They seem to cling together more for the girls and less so for the boys. Like, I think there was one graph to show across time that there's lots of variability for the boys.
Yeah, I just want to see if I
right?
can get that graph and see if it's the one you mean. Do you mean this one? Yes. Okay. So this isn't strictly So these are each averages of behaviors at different ages. So there are these two families where the mothers, and we saw this also in the three-dimensional slides in the cluster analysis, that there were two families where the mothers of the girls were especially different up here in this for two of the families. But on the whole, there's much less variability even in here, even though there's this one mother that's going up and down and up and down. It's the same mother, the purple line. But otherwise, these lines are all clustered together down here. They're actually less variable. And the mothers of boys are more variable. So that's the opposite, I think, of what you were saying. Wait, go back to using the microphone.
Sorry. So statistically, when there's more variability, you're more likely to be able to predict some of that variance, right? But so this is just affectionate touch. And I was just wondering, is this pattern sort of true across the different codes? That, there's just much more variability with how moms are reacting to boys than there are with girls?
No, it differs from code to code, but I don't have the... No, so then I gave you the averages. So, so this gives you the 95% confidence levels, and so you can see here caretaking. There is a wide set of confidence levels here, and a smaller one here. So it's wider for the mothers and smaller for the sons. For the mothers of daughters here, smaller for the mothers of sons here. Here it's more variable for the lifting up. A wider set of confidence limits, less for the mothers of girls. So yeah, and here it doesn't look so different. So it's not. I don't think it's 100% consistent that there's just greater variability for the mothers of boys. But you might be onto something there that's worth looking at more carefully.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. One question, so you opened with kind of, the video with, someone getting lost in the middle,
Yeah.
As far as being gendered at birth. And so I'm curious, kind of with your study here, it seems to be very much binary, the mothers of girls and mothers of boys. I'm curious if you have done any work in looking at the effects kind of in the spectrum of...
No, I haven't done any work like that. And what needs to be done to get at that is to have a longitudinal study that goes out several more years than from what, as I said, it's a found data set. It's a proof of concept, not an answer. So to get at what you're suggesting, I will say that what I think is that as you have gender variation begin to emerge, that it's all part of a range of variation. That where there's some interaction between parenting and between physiological, neurological differences between children. So I think those things are always working together in different ways, and things that are going on in families. But so what you need are large and normative samples in the sense that they are large population samples that don't pre-select the way in which, say, if you study a group of kids who've been brought to a gender identity clinic, you already have a selected sample. And then you study them long enough that you can begin to see what kinds of gender identities emerge. That's the way you could get at that, and my sample certainly doesn't even begin to get at that, so I can't actually address it.
Is there any way with this sample to, in an ideal world, extrapolate a longitudinal study such that you could see what the behaviors of the mothers of the girls and the boys, those behaviors kind of influence gender?
No, not with the sample. You wouldn't want to do that. It would. I mean, first of all, I have no idea what's happened to these kids. They're all adults now. The initial sample was done. The initial filming was done many years ago. So no. And I don't even have a hypothesis as to what behaviors might affect what kind of development. The only thing I can say is that if you look carefully and slowly, you can see differences in behaviors, particularly in these early months, that are differences in parental behaviors that are that come from presumed knowledge of the sex of their child, and that they're probably not conscious. That is, these are such subtle behaviors that it's not likely that the mother's saying, "Oh, I have a little boy, I'm going to move him around." It's something that's much more subtle than that.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for coming tonight. I have
You're
a
welcome.
question, kind of going off of what you just mentioned, the subtleties of the way that mothers interact differently with the females and with the males. And I was wondering if you think that subtlety is coming from instinctually, or is that like a social expectation, kind of what you should do? I know it's subtle, but what do you think on that?
Well, I don't believe in instinct. I don't think it's a useful word, because I don't believe instinct is another way of saying, is it nature and not nurture? It's just another word for it. And nor do I believe that it's social in that, what did you say, social expectation? What was the phrase you used? Social expectations. No, I think that suggests a consciousness of towards the behaviors that I don't wish to impute. I think that we all behave in various ways that are subconscious, and they do come out of our internalized gender norms, but they aren't social expectations. So I think all of that language is like hitting the problem over the head with a hammer. It's the wrong language. I think we have to talk about non-conscious behavior. I think we have to talk about pre-symbolic learning and memory and body memory. And then we have to add in what happens as language comes into play, as children become symbolic operators as well as neural operators, which begins to happen at about, after the first year of life. So I think something much more subtle is at play.
Hello,
Hi.
thanks for coming. I had two questions. One of them is really quick. I'll ask first. Were the sample kids in this study, were they first children?
They were all
second,
first
or-
children.
Okay,
They were all white. They were all sort of lower to middle class.
Okay. And then my second question, which is kind of a little bit more out there, and I just wanted to, from your experience or your thoughts, do you have any ideas about kind of looking at children that grow up not in a traditional home, like maybe foster children or children that move around to different caretakers, and how maybe that experience of having different parents or different caretakers can influence these kinds of things?
So I actually thought you were going to say something different about non-traditional families. But so it's quite clear that the early kinds of attachments that happen in the first year or two of life are very important to infant development, to child development. So the fostering, it would, I think, depend a lot on when the fostering happened and why it happened and whether there had been neglect or not during the first year of life. Are we talking about, so there are a lot of things at question with asking about foster children. So the kind of the question I often get about non-traditional families is what happens when you have same-sex parents. And my answer is also always the same, which is that it's now possible to do a study like that. And it would be extremely interesting to do it, I think, to look at parenting patterns where you had two moms or two dads, and to do the same kind of study. And also start it earlier, carry it out longer, get more concentrated on which codes you want to look at, because you've got to cut back from what we initially started out. We cast this wide net And it's now clear where there are interesting things to look at and where there aren't. So I think looking at lots of different kinds of non-traditional families, looking at culturally diverse families, looking at families with siblings, I mean, all of these different pieces will make a more complicated yet story. And they are the work that if I were now 25, I could start doing for the rest of my life. But I'm hoping that there are some people in here who will take that on, who are not even yet 25, and who will use these kinds of approaches and develop a research program that takes these ideas and really digs into them properly. Because I would make no defense of this as the final approach, but rather I will defend it as a way to look at things a little bit more intelligently and with a theoretical framework that might be more productive.
Hi. Actually, my question in some sense relates to what you just said, because I was wondering about the presence of the fathers in all this. We didn't hear anything about the fathers' interactions with the kids. So,
right.
I mean, we were just talking about same-sex parents, but here we have just the data of
Right.
the mother. So.
Right, so I don't have any data on the, again, this is a found data set. I looked at what I have. I would think getting data, and there's an Israeli psychologist who's done this kind of work and has looked at fathering as well as mothering and there are some interesting different patterns between mothers and fathers in terms of how they play with their infants. But again, there's a huge need to add in both parents, and especially because I think, at least as things are changing traditionally in the United States, fathers are much more involved as parents in those very early years. I mean, so, or in that first year. I have a good friend who just had a baby, and she had the baby, but they both took parental leave for the first 2 months. So father and mother were home for the first 2 months taking care of that baby. That's going to be a very different experience than the traditional kind of structure that we were looking at here. So that also has to get added into the mix. I don't have the data, but it's really appropriate to ask for it.
Thanks. So in traditional models, or traditional dynamic systems model, the baby interacts with the mom, and so there's these bidirectional effects. And so I was wondering, like in the data you present, it's like mom driving a lot of these behaviors, but have you looked at how the infant is responding? So for example, if mom is picking up boys a lot, is it because they enjoy it more? Right, so they have a positive affect to it, which leads her to do it even more. So, in other words, what do you think is the role of the infant in influencing maternal behavior?
Yeah, great question. When the bit of this that on vocalization that we've looked at already, we looked at that to see whether whether there were differences in infant response to maternal vocalization and whether there were differences in maternal response to infant vocalization. And we found a gender difference where we found that the mothers responded more. The boys and girls were vocalizing to the same degree, but that the mothers responded more and set up then more of a cycle of call and response to the girls than they did to the boys. The one hypothesis I've tested with regard to motor development is not whether the infants enjoyed it more, because honestly, with the way the camera angles and things were set up, we can't get at that data, but I did look to see whether the male infants were fidgeting more, crying more, doing things to indicate discomfort that might lead to being picked up more, and we can't find any difference in this data set of the behavior of the male infants in these early months compared to the female infants. But given that what has to be going on is always a dynamic, and that particularly remember at 3 months, infants aren't doing a whole lot, but you could have a very fussy infant that would lead to a lot more handling. But in this particular set of tapes, we didn't see that. again, it's 1 hour once a week in a living room with people running videotape. So the other question is whether you could do a kind of less obtrusive, more complete kind of taping, and there are people working on that kind of approach, getting like a motion activated video, fisheye video in a living room or something, so that anytime during 24 hours that a child and mother were in there, or a child and parent were in there, it would turn on and they'd capture the interaction. And that would give you a more complete interaction, but it also gives you so much data that it's practically impossible to code it. So there's always this back and forth between how do you get it at some of these questions. But you're absolutely right. You have to be asking about what the infant is doing as well as what the mother's doing.
Hi, thank you for your talk. This perspective I think is really interesting, and I imagine it's not the mainstream perspective to think of it as a process rather than a trait. So I'm wondering if you've encountered any pushback from others in your field and what that's been like and how you've handled it.
I've had a hell of a time getting this stuff published. So that's pushback. I think I've finally cracked that nut. But the first few papers that I had took me like 4 years in 3 or 4 different journals before I could get them published. So yeah, there is, in traditional psychology, there has been resistance to this, but I think it's starting to break a little bit. There are, I'll just say that, I think it's starting to break a little bit.
We have time for one more question. So, if no one else is going to take it, I have one myself.
Okay.
So you said in your last slide how these concepts of identity, they're not set in stone, they're shifting. So has anyone done research on, for example, how gender identity changes as you enter your teenage years, or kind of like later in your development, like before you enter full adulthood, but kind of like not this type of like early.
Yeah, there are some longitudinal sociological and psychological studies on these questions, both on on children who are born as girls and children who are identified as girls at birth and children who are identified as boys at birth. So there are some studies on it. I can't recite their findings to you, but there are a couple of good books on the topic.
Join me in thanking our speaker for tonight.
Thank you. Thank all of you. Thank you.